Hello. Thank you for inviting me to this exciting webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land where I am at Brock University is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. For this research, in talking to archivists, librarians, and others, and presenting it publicly, I'm always struck by how few people have ever heard of the so-called Indian hospitals. And I'm intrigued by their reactions. Canada didn't have racially segregated healthcare. Yet when talking with people in Indigenous communities, there's a deep familiarity with the institutions. Many had either personally experienced the institutions or knew somebody in their immediate family that had. And some shared their stories with me. But most of this research is from the National Archives records of the Department of National Health and Welfare. So part of my work tries to understand and explain this apparent erasing of Indigenous experience from public memory. Today, I hope to shed some light on these hospitals, why they were created and how they operated and who lived there and died there. But my research also tries to understand how some histories are remembered and others are allowed to be forgotten. And of course, the consequences of that forgetting. Two particular stories of 20th century healthcare history predominate. One, the dominant story, of course, tells a progressive story of the road to Medicare, from a hard-scrabble provincial plan to the definition of national health that embraced all Canadians. And the steps along the way, the national health grants in the 1940s and 50s, to hospital insurance in the late 50s, and then the victory in Medicare in 1968. And Canadians love that story, not least in comparison to the American experience. But there's nothing in that progressive story that would explain the other prominent 20th century healthcare narrative, and that is the seemingly intractable and enduring health disparities in many, though not all, Indigenous communities. These two prominent 20th century narratives are usually seen as completely separate and unrelated. But I argue that these two stories are intimately linked. The isolation and segregation of Indigenous people in Indian hospitals was central to the dominant project of modernizing healthcare for non-Indigenous Canadians. On the rare occasion that Indian hospitals intruded into the story of progress, it was usually to congratulate Canadians on their humanitarianism. As the Minister of National Health and Welfare, Brooke Claxton, put it when announcing the new Indian Health Service and Indian hospitals in 1946, neither law nor treaty imposed an obligation on the Dominion government to establish a health service for the Indians and Eskimos. However, for humanitarian reasons, and as a very necessary protection to the rest of the population of Canada, it is essential to do everything possible to stamp out disease at its source, wherever it may be within the confines of the country. This would remain government policy for more than 30 years, that its only obligation to provide health care was a moral or humanitarian duty, which allowed it to change policy frequently, which it did. And I'll use the term Indian hospitals throughout to reflect the historical usage that denotes particular character of these institutions. So in the years surrounding the Second World War, Canada embraced a system of racially segregated hospital care, Indian hospitals, more than 25 of them by the 1960s, and they were operated by the Indian Health Service. So imagine, if you will, a young Inuit boy sent from his Arctic village by ship, then alone by airplane, eventually reaching Edmonton's Charles Camsell Indian Hospital. None of the staff could pronounce his single Inuit name, so they simply called him Perry Hospital. After 7 years in hospital, or most of his childhood, he was woken one night and sent by train across the country to Ottawa with no chance to say goodbye to the people, the only people he could remember. He spent many years after attempting to reclaim his identity, his family, and his community. This might be Harry in this slide, we don't know. But this is the carefully constructed story the government provided for Canadians. Fairly healthy looking, happy families together, We know they are Inuit because they are dressed in furs despite being indoors. The image on the left reflects the reality of children, of elderly, being sent alone, like Harry, to an uncertain future. Strangers confined to bunks for weeks or months on end as the ship continued its voyage from village to village, boarding more and more people, and then south to who knows what. On the right is the constructed government image. It implies that families travel together, that the accommodations were roomy, that people somehow enjoyed their adventure, that they had autonomy and choice. Canadians might see the created image on the right in a government publication or maybe a local newspaper, and they might be struck by the contented-looking families and feel satisfied that theirs was a benevolent, caring community. Or imagine, if you will, undergoing lung surgery under local instead of general anesthetic. 16-year-old Dave Melting Tallow from Siksika, the Blackfoot Reserve in Alberta, spent 3 years in the Campbell Indian Hospital in Edmonton, and in 1959 underwent lung resection, or the removal of parts of his lungs, while he was awake. The thoracic surgeon, Dr. Herbert Meltzer, preferred local rather than general anesthesia for his patients undergoing chest surgery. Even his colleagues at the time questioned his method. Defending himself, Meltzer wrote, quote, "The argument that patients suffer mental torture under local anesthesia cannot be entertained. Mild hypnosis counteracts mental strain almost completely." Dave Melting Tallow disagreed. At a time when tuberculosis treatment for Canadians meant outpatient drug therapy, Indigenous patients were assumed to be careless in their health and spent years in hospital, and many underwent invasive surgery before being returned to their communities. As Dave told me, quote, "They removed 3 ribs, and they removed part of my lung. Now I've got these stumps in my back on my left side and no ribs there. They used a saw. I was awake and I could hear the saw. They got partway through and then they told me, now we're breaking the ribs off. When they did that, it felt like somebody hit you inside the chest, and they did that 3 times. I just heard the saw buzzing away and cutting stuff." He could be forgiven for thinking he was the subject of medical experimentation, a disturbingly frequent charge made by former patients. This was not an unusual experience for patients in that Indian hospital. Or imagine, if you will, the distress that would cause 2 Inuk women dressed only in bathrobes and slippers to walk out of the Parc Savard Hospital in Quebec City and into the February winter. With 198 patients, the hospital had only 3 physicians on staff. The building was literally crumbling and infested with cockroaches, fleas, bed bugs, mice, and rats. The 2 women had been in the hospital for 4 years, and with no one on staff who could speak their language, they assumed they would remain there, forgotten indefinitely. It's not clear where they hoped to go in bedclothes in February, but they could be forgiven for thinking they'd be better off almost anywhere else. Now imagine being told that the Canadian government deemed all this necessary, indeed mandated, in order to contain the threat that Indigenous people pose to the national health, and that those in charge of the Indian Health Service were hailed as medical humanitarians in the service of a benevolent state, as the minister pointed out in his 1946 pronouncement. So how did it come to this? Why Indian hospitals? Why segregated hospital care? First, I'll analyze the historical context of the intersection of race, medicine, and public policy in the 1940s and 50s. Second, I'll outline the impact of policy through some patient experiences. And finally, I'll conclude with a consideration of how Medicare, and not the medicine chest, came to define health policy for Indigenous people. Now, for the sake of clarity, I'll use the term Indian Health Service to refer to the bureaucracy responsible for healthcare. It's undergone many name changes since the 1920s. It was the Indian and Northern Health Service. Then later in 1962, it was known as Medical Services Branch. In 2000, it was renamed the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch, and now it's part of Indigenous Services Canada. So Indian Health Services, it is. So why segregated care and why in the 1940s? In one sense, Indian hospitals signaled a dramatic shift in policy. And in another sense, racially segregated care was just a continuation of long-standing practices. Prior to the 1940s, Indian Affairs was rarely interested in expending funds on healthcare. Physicians and bureaucrats had characterized the people as a, quote, dying race. The high rates of disease and death were reasoned to be because Indigenous people couldn't cope with settlement and civilization. The concept of a dying race was also self-fulfilling because it allowed governments to ignore the social and economic conditions leading to ill health. But by the 1940s, Indigenous populations were growing. Indigenous people were increasingly seen in towns and cities. And it's at this point that medical discourse shifts to a focus on the threat or the danger that Aboriginal contagion posed to larger society, particularly how so-called Indian tuberculosis threatened the nation's health. And this was voiced most loudly by the Canadian Tuberculosis Association that represented provincial sanatorium directors and provincial health officials. And they were pushing to have the federal government take responsibility for the health conditions on reserves. So Dr. David Stewart of Manitoba's Provincial Sanatorium warned that reserves were not, quote, disease-tight compartments, that tuberculosis would leak into white communities. Though he admitted that the extent of tuberculosis on reserves was still a matter of much speculation, but the Canadian Tuberculosis Association urged the federal government to take action and establish Indian hospitals in order to protect the nation from this tuberculosis threat. Because, of course, Indigenous people weren't welcome in most provincial sanatoriums. Sanatorium beds were reserved for what were called taxpayers, that is, non-Indigenous people. So fears of tuberculosis spreading motivated some of the demand for Indian hospitals. And this was the dramatic shift, that the government began to direct funds to Indigenous healthcare. But that the institutions would be racially segregated was a continuation of past practices. Racially segregated hospital care was considered normal and natural, particularly in the North and West. In British Columbia, Chinese and Japanese patients in the early 20th century suffered in Vancouver General Hospital's basement ward H, or in the St. Joseph's Oriental Hospital. There were segregated wards, usually a basement or outbuilding, for First Nations patients in many hospitals. Manitoba's St. Boniface Sanatorium maintained a separate Indian building. Yellowknife Hospital confined Indigenous patients to its 10-bed Indian wing with a separate entrance and waiting room. The color line in hospital care was certainly drawn by community prejudice, but it was also maintained by Indian Affairs policy that paid hospitals only about 2/3 of their hospital accounts to treat Indigenous patients. Recall, this is before hospital and healthcare insurance. Hospitals expected to be paid. Not surprisingly, community hospital boards resented the Indian Affairs policy. So community hospitals felt justified in providing inadequate care in Indian wings and basement wards, or refusing care altogether in favor of the paying patient that would pay their bills. So policy and practice actively shaped inequality and constructed the image of Indigenous people as less worthy of care. But at the Indian hospitals established in the 1930s, Dynevor Hospital in Manitoba, and the Fort Qu'Appelle Indian Hospital, built in 1936 in Saskatchewan. At these hospitals, Indian Affairs found that they could operate at half the cost of care of community hospitals. And we'll see some of the impact of that cost cutting. The Indian hospitals then were considerably cheaper than care in community hospitals, if it could be had. And this, more than anything, recommended the post-war expansion of the Indian hospital system. So in 1945, the Indian Health Service was moved from Indian Affairs to the new Department of National Health and Welfare, which was the flagship of the welfare state when it was formed. The state demonstrated its commitment to include Indigenous people in the calculations of national health, if only to keep them sufficiently isolated. To paraphrase philosopher Michel Foucault, an ascended bureaucracy with its focus on Indian hospitals represented an effort not to isolate less, but to isolate better. 2 months after the minister's pronouncement in August 1946, war hero and Canada's Governor-General, Field Marshal Viscount Alexander of Tunis, with a wave of his hand, declared open the Charles Council Indian Hospital in Edmonton. This wasn't the first hospital, of course, but it was the largest, with more than 500 beds. But its substantial facade obscured the mess of tinder-dry buildings that made up most of its wards. This is the rear view of the hospital. The back of the brick building is on your left. Originally a Jesuit college for boys, during the Second World War, the building had been the American military's headquarters while building the Alaska Highway, when the Canadian government took over. Like the Council Hospital, subsequent Indian hospitals opened in the 1940s were also in borrowed buildings, many in old military facilities. Miller Bay near Prince Rupert, BC, which is completely isolated in the bush. Nanaimo Indian Hospital on Vancouver Island, and the North Battleford Indian Hospital at the Military Air Force. As I said, more than 25 in all, most of them in Ontario and West. Now, Indian hospitals, though they were rationalized as tuberculosis sanatoria, were in fact general hospitals. They admitted all patients, pediatric, maternity, as well as tuberculosis, based on race, not disease. Tuberculosis at the time was seen as too dangerous in general hospitals, hence the existence of sanatoriums. But these hospitals, Indian hospitals, were established on the premise, indeed the promise, that they would operate at half the cost of care in increasingly expensive community hospitals. And as redundant military buildings, they had large dormitory-style wards because they had previously just treated men. But that kind of ward was dangerous in a general hospital treating men, women, and children. For instance, a young girl admitted from the Edmonton Residential School to the Council Hospital for appendicitis actually contracted tuberculosis once she was in the hospital. The Indian Association of Alberta, of course, they were never asked for their input, but at their 1949 annual meeting, they praised the Council Indian Hospital's good work. But they also voiced some concern, and I quote, "We see old people in the same wards as TB patients, and children playing in the same rooms where old people are lying sick. We fear there's a great danger of infection spreading under such conditions." Their concerns were dismissed by Indian Health Service bureaucrats as the work of, quote, malcontents. But the hospital superintendent, Dr. Mattis, admitted to his superiors in the bureaucracy that cross-infection was a constant problem. Citing the example of a boy admitted to the hospital for repair of an umbilical hernia, at first a middle ear infection prevented surgery. When the infection subsided, he then developed in turn chickenpox, measles, bronchopneumonia, rubella, and another ear infection. In Unit 3, where women and children with all manner of illnesses were kept together, it had developed into what the superintendent called, quote, more or less a pest house, unquote. Nevertheless, he judged the patients still better off than in their homes. And this became a common justification, and it was similar to the rationales for residential schools, that Indian hospitals were not compared to accepted hospital standards, but rather were compared to the patient's supposed inadequate homes. So the ruthless economizing and overcrowding at Indian hospitals stands in sharp contrast to the millions invested annually in provincial hospitals, at the same time by the same bureaucracy, National Health and Welfare. These were the National Health Grants. They began in 1948, and for 20 years, the federal grants matched provincial funds for, among other things, $13 million annually for provincial projects of hospital construction. In the first 5 years of the program, Canada added 46,000 new hospital beds. 30 new hospitals were added every year for a decade. Public funds created these modern new hospitals that would attract the right patient, that is, the paying patient, while at the same time, Indian hospitals assured Canadians that they needn't share their modern hospitals with Indigenous people. The Indian Health Service, with its low civil service wages, also ensured that Indian hospitals would never draw qualified staff or other resources away from community hospitals, with dire consequences for Indigenous patients. Though Indian hospitals did provide opportunities for First Nations workers, it was invariably in the unskilled, poorly paid positions as domestic maids and janitors. Despite promises, there were never any training programs established at any of the Indian hospitals. On the other hand, there were unprecedented opportunities for physicians and nurses that were created by the National Health Grant's hospital construction. But few chose work for low wages at the often isolated and poorly equipped Indian hospitals. For example, at the North Battleford Indian Hospital in Saskatchewan, in 1955, a 4-month-old infant was admitted with severe bronchopneumonia, but whose condition, according to the physician, was, quote, fairly good. He was found dead in his crib the next day. With 1 registered nurse and 1 aide on a ward of 14 seriously ill infants, there was simply neither the time nor the hands to care adequately for the patient. The accepted nursing standard at the time was 5 hours of nursing for seriously ill infants. With its staffing levels, the hospital could provide only 2 hours of care. Staffing levels remained the same in the wake of the infant's death. Likewise, for physicians in the 1950s, private practice and hospital appointments were increasingly lucrative. Civil service wages at Indian hospitals, of course, failed to keep pace. As T.Q. Young also found in his study of the Sioux Lookout Indian Hospital in Ontario, Indian hospitals attracted those who couldn't get work elsewhere. At the Lady Willingdon Hospital at Six Nations in Ontario in 1954, the hospital superintendent, who was also the surgeon, reported a woman's death on his operating table as he had performed minor surgery. In reporting her death to his superiors, the surgeon said, quote, "This unfortunate episode again points out very specifically the urgent need for well-qualified medical staff. We were fortunate in having a coroner with an unbiased mind. Otherwise, an inquest might have resulted in undesirable publicity concerning an unqualified anesthetist. With collusion between Indian Health Service officials and a, quote, unbiased coroner, the appalling affair never came to light." The surgeon continued in his report to his superiors, quote, "It's clear that we're attracting medical officers, many of whom have been failures elsewhere, or who have handicaps which militate against a successful ordinary practice." The unqualified anesthetist remained at the hospital while the surgeon was promoted to headquarters in Ottawa. Presumably, the coroner continued to cover up malpractice at the hospital. Certainly, there were caring and concerned employees, but patients most often recall their helplessness at the hands of ever-changing parade of medical staff. Given that the Indian Health Service mandate was to protect the national health, coercion characterized its operations. Dr. Percy Moore was the Indian Health Service director from 1944 until his retirement in 1965. And he put it bluntly, quote, "We certainly do not feel that our program should be left to the whims of an Indian as to whether or not he will accept treatment." Moore had the Indian Act amended in 1953 to include what were called the Indian Health Regulations that essentially criminalized ill health. The regulations made possible the detention and incarceration of the ill. Exposing the limits of Canada's liberalism, the regulations forms 7018-8 A, B, and C authorized, respectively, compulsory medical examination and treatment, arrest and detention, and the forced return of patients to hospital. This is the Form C, an apprehension order. Some patients chose instead to remove themselves from families and communities. Bureaucrats in Saskatchewan in 1961 complained that though a warrant had been issued for her arrest, a 77-year-old woman is, quote, hiding herself somewhere in the bush to avoid arrest by the RCMP. By criminalizing ill health, the Indian health regulations codified the fears, real or imagined, of the threat posed by Indian people. Think about that, criminalizing ill health. Not surprisingly, coercion continued within the hospitals as well, where strict order and bed rest were important for treatment. The staff at Charles Council Hospital jokingly referred to a condition they called castitis, where misbehaving children were immobilized by plaster casts on both legs with a bar connecting the cast so they couldn't move. One patient, Agnes Bruno, recalled how all the girls on her ward were put in casts as punishment for getting out of bed. The Indian Health Service also reassured Canadians of their humanitarianism by creating hundreds of images of surprisingly healthy and happy-looking hospital patients. The National Film Board also produced a number of films about the hospitals that painted a similar picture. Like the images of Inuit on board ship, these images were carefully produced to portray happy and grateful patients, but also, more importantly, to convey a benevolent and generous and caring state. But more thoughtful images were also produced. In 1952, gifted portrait photographer Joseph Karsh from Ottawa, already famous for his 1941 portrait of a scowling Winston Churchill that graced the cover of Time magazine, visited the Charles Council Indian Hospital for Maclean's magazine. His portraits were also carefully constructed, but they compellingly capture the patient's loneliness and frustration. Putting racial segregation at the core of the growing welfare state, Indian hospitals stood alongside their more modern white counterparts. Literally, the Indian hospitals sat right next to the community hospitals at Sioux Lookout, Ontario, Port Alexander, Manitoba, and the Blood Hospital at Cardston, Alberta. And First Nations communities, many of whom initially welcomed the Indian hospitals as the belated acknowledgement of the treaty right to health care and as a first step towards better health, found instead that the state's commitment ended with hospitalization, while reserve poverty with contaminated drinking water and overcrowded housing continued and continues unabated. Separate bureaucratic silos of Indian affairs responsible for reserve sanitation and housing and Indian Health Service to look after healthcare encouraged this vertical or treatment-specific approach to health services and all but ensured continued health disparities. Hospitals treated those made ill by reserve poverty only to return them to it. By the early 1960s, definitions of the national health again shifted, and there was a move to begin to shut down the hospitals. As we have seen, the National Health Grants Program had added thousands of new modern hospital beds for Canadian communities. But while escalating costs meant a hospital stay was getting too expensive for even middle-class Canadians, prompting the introduction of national hospital insurance in 1957. With its investment in hospital insurance for all Canadians, the federal government and Indian Health Services would, as they put it, quietly close Indian hospitals and invest instead in community hospitals to expand to make room for Indigenous patients. And this fit nicely with the state's assimilation policy, where First Nations would shed their cultural and legal difference and disappear finally into the larger fabric of society. With them would go their special status, treaties, and reserves. Resistance to hospital closures emerged from all sides. First Nations communities argued that funds intended for their healthcare should be spent on much needed improvements in Indian hospitals and not given to non-Aboriginal community institutions. Certainly, First Nations understood the Indian hospital's limitations, but the institutions, particularly those established near reserves, had become important community assets, providing needed wage labor, and where First Nations workers acted as interpreters and cultural brokers for children and the elderly, blunting the paternalism and coercion. For their part, provincial health departments and some community hospitals also resisted Indian hospital closures, arguing that local hospitals should be reserved for themselves as citizens, and that First Nations patients were taking up beds that didn't belong to them, deeming Aboriginal patients a burden best cared for by the federal government. First Nations, too, had good reasons to fear their treatment at community hospitals, to fear a return to restricted access and basement wards. But in resisting hospital closures, many First Nations communities defended their hospitals as the state's concrete acknowledgement of a treaty or legal right to health care. In negotiation of many of the 11 numbered treaties in the late 19th and early 20th century, medicine and health was discussed, although promises invariably failed to appear in the written treaty text. The sole exception was Treaty 6, 1876, in what became Central Saskatchewan and Alberta, in light green on this slide, whose text promised, quote, a medicine chest. Moreover, in all treaty areas, at subsequent annual treaty payments, people receive vaccinations, chest x-rays, and other medical care, confirming the link, the clear link of healthcare to the treaty relationship. Treaty 6 Chief Sam Swimmer of the Sweetgrass First Nation, who spent his final years in the North Battleford Indian Hospital in Saskatchewan in the 1950s, emphasized how the Indian hospital represented the treaty right to health care. In his metaphorical style, quote, when the treaty was first made with the Queen, the Indians were told the government that was to look after them was pretty nearly as strong as God. But the government was blind in both eyes, and the Indians suffered. As the years passed by, the government's eyes were opened, just enough to give us our own doctors and hospitals. The treaty right to health care was and remains contested. The courts in the 1960s determined that the medicine chest clause did not confer a treaty right to health care, but instead it meant no more than the words clearly convey, that is, essentially a first aid kit. The government closed more Indian hospitals and forced Indigenous people into provincial institutions, in keeping with its long-standing aim to assimilate Indigenous people. And then in 1968, in anticipation of the expensive Medicare plan, Indian Health Service devised its health plan for Indians that cut budgets and severely limited people's access to medical care. It was an ominous foreshadowing of the white paper the following year that proposed to rescind all treaties and sever completely the federal government's treaty and legal relationship with Indigenous people. Though the white paper was withdrawn within the year, the health plan remained in place, and more Indian hospitals were closed, often creating considerable anxiety for vulnerable patients who faced hostility in community hospitals where they were treated like beggars in institutions that didn't want them, and that they were somehow less worthy of care. It wasn't until 1979, in response to the determined resistance by First Nations to the state's continued attempts to shift responsibility to the provinces, that Indian Health Services drafted a new Indian health policy that acknowledged that health policy flowed from, quote, constitutional and statutory provisions, not an affirmation of the treaty right to health, but it did move beyond the long-held claim that Indian Health Services policies stem from little more than a moral obligation. That 1979 Indian health policy continues as the federal government's guiding statement on healthcare. The struggle then turned to state responsibility for the so-called non-insured health benefit, or the to 40% of all health services not covered by Medicare. And that wasn't resolved until 1984, but which continues to cause endless delays and poor service. So it's not until relatively recently that Indigenous communities could approach healthcare facilities and feel that their needs might be met. Though the legacy of the Indian hospitals means that there are many who approach healthcare very cautiously and very selectively. To conclude, Canadians are eminently satisfied with Medicare, perhaps not for its efficiency or effectiveness, but proudly telling the 2002 Romano Royal Commission that Medicare's values of equity, fairness, and solidarity are, quote, intimately tied to their understanding of citizenship. But Indigenous citizenship was always incomplete and contingent. Denied the most basic right of the vote before 1960, First Nations faced serial projects aimed at terminating their Aboriginal and treaty rights thereafter. Lines of segregation and isolation, tended by the power of the state and rationalized in the language of medical humanitarianism, did not negate Canada's liberal democratic values. In fact, it was integral to the formation of national health as normal white citizenship. More than a half century of contradictory and arbitrary policies that served the interests of non-Indigenous population left a destructive legacy in Indigenous communities and beyond. When Canadians think of the post-World War II period, they think of a progressive story, the road to Medicare, as one book title has it. But along that road, Indigenous people were made to do with less. And when Medicare became a reality, it was at the cost of treaty rights. Health disparities between Canada generally and many First Nations were constructed, not found, and are rooted in this history. And they endure, and they have come to be seen as somehow normal and inevitable. In this age of truth and reconciliation, by remembering the history of Indian hospitals and racially segregated care, Canadians can begin to see how our privilege came at such a terrible cost. Thank you.